The road to the Revolution began with the French and Indian War, a conflict between Britain and France. Ultimately, Britain won this war, gaining greater colonial power, but also amassing a great amount of debt. Bitter feelings arose between the colonists and the British, and it was decided that the colonies needed some major reorganizing. With the end of this policy of salutary neglect came a series of laws and acts intended to restrict colonial independence and make up for the high costs of the war. The Proclamation Line of 1763 forbade colonists from settling past the Appalachian Mountains as a result of increased tensions with Native American tribes. Colonists were beginning to feel boxed in and resented Britain for not letting them settle where they pleased.
The Navigation Acts intended to promote trade between Britain and America and restricted trade with foreign countries. This wasn't so nice for the Americans, who traded often with the French and Dutch. Things like tobacco and eventually iron and steel were restricted and gave Britain a total monopoly on these numerated goods. Other acts like the Currency Act, which made the colonies unable to print their own money. The Sugar Act and the Quartering Act followed soon after, taxing more goods and forcing the colonies to host British soldiers in their homes. The Stamp Act was one of the biggest acts, putting a tax on pretty much everything wrapped in paper. This gave rise to the Sons of Liberties who attacked stamp collectors and made violent protests against British policies.
The colonists began to feel that they had no representation in British Parliament. The Virginia Resolves, passed by Patrick Henry and the Virginia House of Burgesses, sought to address this issue, but Britain refused to acknowledge it. They stated that the colonies had virtual representation and that even though they didn't have an active part in Parliament, that their best interests were in mind. The Stamp Act Congress was formed from 9 different colonies to issue the Declaration of Rights and Grievances, which was basically a letter complaining about all the things that they wanted to change. Keep in mind that the colonists still consider themselves British and don't really want independence. After realizing the backlash from the Stamp Act, the Declaratory Act was issued soon after in an attempt to save face by the British. After Prime Minister Grenville was replaced by Lord Rockingham up in England, the Townshend Acts were put into place. Taxes were placed on huge numbers of items such as lead, tea, paint, glass, and paper. This made the colonists pretty angry. In response, John Dickinson wrote letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania which protested Britain's right to tax without representation. The resident troops in Boston also frustrated the colonists, which led to a ramping up of tensions, eventually ending in the Boston Massacre. This influential accident was able to spark outrage throughout the colonies, mostly due to Paul Revere's engraving of the event as seen through an anti-British lens. It was a key cause in getting America energized to fight the Revolution, along with the masterfully written Common Sense pamphlet by Thomas Paine. This pamphlet was written in the language of the everyday colonist and gave clear, concise arguments on why it was time for America's independence. The Sons of Liberty seized the fever and outrage after the Boston Massacre by spreading propaganda to keep the anti-British sentiment high. Not long after, they got their outlet in the form of the Tea Act. The British enforced tea monopoly angered the colonists and prompted the Sons of Liberty to organize the Boston Tea Party. Britain's response was to pass the Intolerable or Coercive Acts, intended to punish Boston by closing Boston Harbor, revoking the Massachusetts Charter, move officer trials to England, and to bring back the Quartering Act. This was enough to warrant the First Continental Congress. Here, the Suffolk Resolves were created as another sort of list of grievances and declaration of what the colonies were going to do to combat it. One of the biggest things that was stated was saying that the colonies would boycott British goods and recommend local militias be formed. The implication behind this was that the colonies would use violence to get what they wanted, and Britain's response would be to try to seize the supplies of the colonists. The British managed to defeat the colonies at Lexington, but a prior warning meant we could beat them back at Concord. Second Continental Congress formed shortly after this, but it wasn't really about independence. It was very close at hand. The Declaration of the Causes of Taking Up Arms was written first, but the Olive Branch Petition was what they really wanted. It was basically a plea for peace from the King of England, but was already too late to stop the drive for independence. By the time these documents made it to England, it was practically war. The signing of the Declaration of Independence was the biggest final starting point of the war as the official start. On July 4th, 1776, America had become a sovereign nation and war had begun.